I have seen people work for years and still lose faith in compounding after less than 300 days. That is one of the cruel jokes money plays on the impatient. A person saves, a person invests, a person denies himself a few pleasures, a person opens the account every week, sometimes every day, waiting to feel the great machine begin to move. And what does he see? A number that barely changes, a little green, a little red, a month of effort erased by a bad week, another month of effort followed by a gain so small it feels insulting. Then the thought comes, maybe this is pointless. That thought has destroyed more futures than bad markets ever will. The danger in the beginning is not that compounding fails. The danger is that it feels too quiet to be believed. I want to talk to you about that quiet. Not because it is glamorous, because it is where most people lose. If you survive the early stage, compounding can do astonishing things for an ordinary person. If you quit in the early stage, you walk away before the machine ever had enough mass to prove itself. That is why I want to give you a better way to think about it. Not as motivation. Motivation is weak, not as hope. Hope is unreliable as structure, because structure can carry you through the stretch where the scoreboard lies to you. I learned a very long time ago that most people do not need more excitement in finance. They need a way to stay in the game long enough for simple arithmetic to become visible. That is a much humbler goal than becoming rich quickly. It is also a much more profitable one. A man once told me he had stayed consistent for 287 days before he decided compounding was probably overrated. That number amused me and saddened me at the same time. 287 days, less than 1 year, less than one ordinary cycle of weather, less than enough time for a good business to prove anything meaningful, less than enough time for a small savings habit to build any emotional credibility at all. He did not quit because he was lazy. He quit because the number on the screen did not flatter him. That is the part no one explains honestly enough. The first stage of compounding does not feel like growth. It feels like disbelief. You are putting money into something that refuses to behave like a paycheck. Work no longer leads directly to visible reward. Effort no longer produces an immediate emotional result. Your brain hates that. Human beings are built to understand straight lines, work today, get paid today, plant effort, receive proof. Compounding does not honor that rhythm. It asks for patience first and evidence later. That is why so many people fail in the boring chapter. And the boring chapter is where the ending is really decided. I want you to picture a young man named Harry, not because his name matters, because his life does. Harry is not a finance professional. He is not one of these boys who sit on the internet all day discussing macro theory and pretending they can predict what a central bank will say 3 months from now. He is a hotel front desk agent, rotating shifts, uneven sleep, vending machine coffee, a cramped apartment he shares with a roommate, a checking account that never stays impressively high for very long. He tells himself he will get serious once life settles down. That is a phrase I have heard from thousands of people. Once life calms down, the funny thing about life is that it almost never calms down in the manner people imagine. It simply changes costume. One stress leaves, another arrives, one bill disappears, another takes its place. One problem gets solved and a newer one immediately introduces itself as though it had been waiting politely in the hallway for its turn. People who wait for calm usually wait too long. Harry had tried the usual nonsense before. He downloaded the apps, he watched the clips, he listened to men with very white teeth and great confidence explain that if you just stay disciplined, future you will thank you. That is true, by the way. It is also too vague to be useful when the market falls and your account balance looks foolish compared with the effort it took to build it. Harry would invest a little, then the market would dip, the number would drop. And he would ask the same question ordinary people always ask in the early stage. What is the point? Now, let me tell you the answer. The point is not the number yet. That is what most people do not understand in the beginning. The point is not growth. The point is construction. You are not yet being rewarded for what the machine produces. You are still building the machine. Those are two different phases of life. A man standing at a construction site does not complain that the finished building is not already paying rent. He understands that the foundation comes first, the frame comes next. And the finished structure only begins behaving like an asset after enough invisible work has already been done. People are rational around buildings. They are irrational around money. They expect the emotional payoff before the economic structure is ready. That is where the 843 rule becomes useful. Not because it is magical. I dislike magic in finance, because it gives the mind a timetable that makes the early silence easier to understand. I am not telling you that money literally doubles on a fixed schedule, or that every market behaves on command. That would be childish. Markets do not owe you smoothness. What the 843 rule gives you is a way to understand how compounding usually feels. The first 8 years feel like effort dragging a reluctant object. The next 4 feel like the object finally rolling. The last 3 feel as if the object has become heavy enough to create its own momentum. Same physics, same discipline, different emotional experience. That is why people who quit in year 3 or year 5 make such a tragic error. They are not walking away from failure. They are walking away from a structure that had not yet become visible enough to comfort them. I want to stay with Harry for a while because his example is ordinary, and ordinary is where real wealth either gets built or not. He took home about $3,379 a month. Not an internet income, not a fantasy salary, a real one. He split rent with a roommate. He worked odd shifts. He bought too much coffee from machines because fatigue is expensive when you are poor. He kept telling himself he would save properly after the next raise, the next break, the next cleaner period of life. I have always disliked that kind of sentence. It sounds adult. It is usually surrender wearing a polite tie. Harry was not failing because he lacked ambition. He was failing because he wanted inspiration to do the work that should have been turned into a mechanism. Mechanisms are one of the great secrets of good financial behavior. People think discipline is an emotional state. Often it is simply a trigger connected to a repeated action that is much more dependable. A person who requires motivation each month is building on weather. A person who builds a trigger is building on routine. Harry did something simple enough that many people would laugh at it. Good. I have often found that small practical methods look ridiculous right before they become life-changing. Every time he clocked out, he held his hotel key card in his hand for 10 seconds and asked himself one question. Did I buy my future today? That was all. No speech, no shame. No budget worksheet, no ritual of self-hatred, because the month had not gone perfectly. Just the question, did I buy my future today? If the answer was yes, he moved on. If the answer was no, he did something immediately. Sometimes it was only $29, sometimes $37, sometimes $51, embarrassingly small by the standards of the internet and extraordinarily important by the standards of a real life. He opened his brokerage account and placed a buy order into a broad index fund. That is what I want you to notice. The amount was not heroic. The repeatability was. People worship the giant gesture and ignore the repeatable one. That is one reason the public stays poor in spirit, even when it learns good ideas. It wants the transformation to feel dramatic. Real transformation often feels dull. The dullness is part of its strength. The hotel key card was not a piece of financial brilliance. It was a door. Same cue, same question, same action. That is how habits stop requiring speeches. The next useful thing Harry learned was that he had been watching the wrong scoreboard. This is one of the biggest mental errors small investors make. They track dollars. They should track ownership. Dollars are emotional. Dollars swing. Dollars obey prices. The investor does not control and rarely understands. A person looks at dollar value in the early stage and sees noise, insult, and delay. Shares are calmer, shares stack. If the market drops, the dollar value may look worse. But the next contribution buys more ownership. The person who watches only the account balance feels pain. The person who watches share count can still see accumulation. That difference matters enormously in the early years. Harry began writing his share count on a small card and keeping it where he could not avoid it. Not in some performative place, not on social media, not as a boast, as a correction. He needed his eyes to see the truth. In the first stage, the truth is not that your account is impressively larger. The truth is that your ownership is steadily increasing. Those are not the same thing. Once he understood that, the market downturn stopped looking like insults and started looking more like sales. Not fun, not pleasant, not easy, simply less confusing. This is an underrated victory in investing. You do not need to become fearless. You need to become less confused. Confusion is what makes people cash out of a good process and walk back into a life where the future remains unfunded. Now let me show you why the 8-4-3 rule is so psychologically valuable. In the first 8 years, your contributions do most of the visible lifting. That is the period where people are tempted to say compounding is a myth because the machine still looks too small. In truth, the machine is being built. The issue is not that nothing is happening. The issue is that the part happening is still dominated by you. That is emotionally unsatisfying. It is also normal. A man starting with zero, investing about $237 a month on average, is not going to look rich after 1 year. Of course he is not. After 1 year, he may have contributed around $2,844. If the market helped a little, fine. If it did not, also fine. The point is not what the statement says after 1 year. The point is whether the habit exists. Most people underestimate how radical that sentence is. The habit exists in finance. A habit is a machine. A machine is more important than 1 year as a result. After 3 years, the account may still not feel impressive enough to satisfy the ego. That is the exact stage where many people commit the great error. They tell themselves that if 3 years did not make a visible difference, 15 will not either. That is the lie of the middle stage. The human brain draws the wrong line from incomplete data because it wants to protect itself from delayed hope. I want you to reject that instinct completely. The fact that a seed does not look like a tree after a while does not prove it is not becoming one. You see, compounding is not linear in its emotional effect. That is what makes it so hard to believe at first. The first dollars fight uphill. The later dollars arrive to help a base that already exists. Then the returns begin adding to the contributions in a way the nervous system can finally feel. Then later still, the returns themselves start producing numbers large enough that the owner begins asking a new question. When did this thing start moving without me doing all the work? That is the handoff. That is what the 8-4-3 rule is really pointing at. In the early stretch, you are the engine. In the middle stretch, you and your money share the job. In the later stretch, the money begins doing a larger share than your emotions thought was possible. Back when you almost quit, I have always believed that one of the great tragedies in financial life is that most people never stay in long enough to experience the handoff. They quit during disbelief. That is why the first 8 years matter so much. Not because the number 8 is sacred, because the early years are where identity is built. Harry eventually realized something most people do not realize until far too late. The first stage is not about getting rich. It is about becoming unbreakable. That is a more valuable objective. Anyway, a person who becomes unbreakable in the presence of market noise has developed one of the rarest and most useful financial traits there is. He no longer needs each month to feel good in order to continue doing what is good. That is strength, and strength makes later wealth possible. He did another small thing I admired. He made quitting expensive in a childish enough way that it worked. If he ever sold out in a panic, he owed his roommate $43 immediately. Not later, not perhaps instantly. It was a silly penalty. Good silly penalties often work because they bypass the brain's talent for elegant excuses. Suddenly, quitting was no longer an abstract emotional release. It had a price. A small price, but real enough to interrupt the impulse. People laugh at this sort of thing. Then they lose money in much dumber ways. A small private rule that keeps you in a good system is more intelligent than a large public opinion about market strategy that collapses the first time prices fall. This is what I mean by mechanism. I am for anything that keeps a good investor from becoming his own saboteur. The next part of Harry S. development was even more important. Life attacked him, which is what life always does. His car needed nearly $1,000 in repairs. Not the theatrical kind of repair you use to tell a story later. The ordinary offensive kind. The kind that appears at exactly the wrong moment and demands cash. This is where many compounding journeys get interrupted. A person says, I have to sell a little, just this once. I need to solve the present problem. And the account is sitting there. That is the beginning of many bad habits. It is why I care so much about reserves. Harry did not sell. He took extra shifts for 2 weeks and paid the repair that way. I do not tell you this because I worship struggle. I tell you because in that moment he proved something far more important than what his account balance happened to be. He proved he was becoming the kind of person who does not cash out his future to solve every present inconvenience. That identity is worth more than many investors realize. A great many people are not failing because they lack return. They are failing because every problem reaches backward into the future and takes money from it. That is why building the person matters as much as building the account. Now I want to say something about the middle stretch, the 4 years after the engine is built. This is where many people get the wrong lesson. The portfolio begins moving more noticeably. A strong market year may produce gains large enough to finally feel real. The account may make more in a month than your contributions had once made. In several, the machine that looked dead starts behaving as if it has recognized your effort and become cooperative. That is a dangerous phase if you are not careful. Because the temptation changes in the early stretch, the temptation is to quit because it feels too slow. In the middle stretch, the temptation is to become arrogant because it finally feels fast enough. People say, I am good at this. Often they are not. They simply stayed long enough to be helped by ordinary math. That is why I admire boring investors. The boring investor does not confuse the handoff with genius. He just keeps buying the playlist, as Harry called it. He does not need to pick the perfect song. He owns the basket, the broad market, the productive machine, American enterprise, perhaps global enterprise too, depending on the structure. He lets the playlist keep playing. That is how wealth often enters a life, not through a dramatic solo, through a durable basket. There is another reason I like the playlist image. People keep thinking they must find the one company, the one trade, the one huge moment that changes everything. Often the change comes from owning a broad enough slice of productive businesses and letting time sort the leaders for you. Some songs disappoint, some fail entirely. The playlist still works. That is what a good index fund does. It keeps you close to the productive capacity of the whole machine rather than asking you to be a fortune teller. I do not dislike intelligence. I dislike unnecessary heroics. The middle stretch of compounding belongs to people who can remain boring, even after the account finally begins flattering them. Harry did that. He kept the same key card trigger. He kept the same share tracking. He kept the same schedule. He did not suddenly decide he was a macro expert. He did not start flipping in and out because now he had enough money to feel opinionated. He did what worked before and allowed time to become more visible. That is the hard thing in investing once the process starts finally rewarding you. You are tempted to improve it into something worse. Do not. Let me give you the final stretch. The 3 years where compounding begins to feel almost strange. I do not mean strange mathematically. I mean strange emotionally. The account starts behaving as if another contributor has entered the room. At first you pushed the car, then you and the rolling car shared the work. Then the car had enough motion that momentum itself was helping. Same car, same road, same physical reality, different stage. That is what people need to understand. Compounding does not become magical because a switch is pulled. It becomes visible because enough time, enough contributions, and enough staying power finally create a mass that can move differently. This is what almost no beginner truly believes until he sees it on his own statement. The returns begin having months that feel larger than your old contributions. A good year can add what once felt impossible. The account begins to affect your mood less as a fragile object and more as a working engine. That is what everyone wants. Almost nobody wants the boring years required to get there. I want you to accept the boring years, accept them as design, not defect. That is the whole correction. Once you do that, the experience changes. You stop asking compounding to entertain you. You stop asking it to prove itself too early. You stop opening the account like a child, checking the oven every few minutes and wondering why the bread is not finished. You begin understanding that the machine has stages and that your job in the first stage is simply not to abandon it. That is a much more realistic expectation. And realistic expectations are one of the greatest forms of investor protection. So if you ask me what to do starting today, I would tell you something very simple. Pick a broad, low-cost investment vehicle you can understand and hold for many years, a true basket, a playlist. Not one song you hope becomes your entire future. Then choose a trigger you cannot easily avoid. Not payday if payday makes you fragile, something physical, something tied to your existing life. A work badge, your lunch break, your parking spot, brushing your teeth at night. The trigger should be boring enough to survive your moods. Track your ownership, not your feelings. Shares, not vibes. And then commit to the first 8 years with full honesty. Tell yourself the truth before the market teaches it to you rudely. These first years are not supposed to impress me. They are supposed to build me. That is a much better sentence than most investors carry into the beginning. I do not need you inspired. I need you consistent. I do not need you talking about discipline. I need you making the next small purchase when the trigger appears. I do not need you predicting the market. I need you staying in it through the noise. I do not need you rich next year. I need you unbreakable enough that later wealth becomes possible. That is the structure. That is the rule. That is why compounding is not really slow. It is only invisible for a while, and invisible progress is where impatient people lose what patient people later call the miracle. There is no miracle. There is only time, ownership, repetition, and refusal to quit during the chapter that felt too boring to matter. It matters more than any other. The first stage is disbelief. The second is movement. The third is wait. That is the 8-4-3 rule as I would want you to remember it. Not as a formula promising riches, as a lens protecting you from your own impatience. Because impatience, not the market, is what usually robs ordinary people of the future they were closer to building than they realized. Stay through the disbelief. Build the engine, protect the streak. Let the shares stack. And one day, much later than your emotions wanted but earlier than your fear suggested, the machine will begin doing something wonderful. It will start helping you more than you are helping it. That is when people call compounding magical. I call it delayed honesty. And delayed honesty is still honesty. It pays those who stayed.